Hi, I'm Rick from the Institute for Agriculture and Horticulture, and today I'm speaking to James Green, the Group Director of Agriculture at fresh producer Gee's Fresh, and we're looking to get an insight into the technology that they use, but also importantly, some of the key things they consider when they might be bringing new technologies into their business. So, hi James, thank you so much for joining us. Could you give us a little introduction to who you are, your experience and your role there, please?
Yeah, hi there, I'm Rick. So Gee's Group Director of Ag at Gee's Fresh, been with the business about 20 years, have a background in both farming and finance. More recently been running our data and modelling team. We've been modelling some of our crops for quite some time now to get better guide on our availability, as well as having a good overview of some of the other digital activities that are going on within our growing and packing operations.
That's fantastic. I mean, it's great that you can talk a little bit already about like the data, because that's such a growth area, excuse the pun perhaps, in agriculture and horticultural technology. And I was just wondering, would you be able to talk a little bit about some of the technologies that Gee's Fresh already uses and some of the data you might be pulling in from those technologies already?
So I think, as you say, the biggest challenge is getting the right data together with all the other data, because many providers have their own platforms, which we find rather frustrating. So it's trying to de-silo the data. And what is that data? So you've got weather stations, you may have soil moisture meters, you've got weather forecasts, we've got sort of more what you might call production physical data that we want to link to that, and then sort of geospatial data from tractor GPS, mapping systems, soil types. So a whole range of different bits of data that obviously are all linked to outcomes effectively, and we're trying to match, I suppose, outcomes to the various parameters that have generated those outcomes. So that's the challenge. We have actually more recently embarked on creating our own sort of data lake within the business, because actually we found it too difficult to be on any one platform, because they generally only do 80% of what you need, and then there's 20% maybe not there, and of course another platform has the other 80% and the first 20% is missing. So we very much see data as an investment. We're sort of, I suppose, privileged and able to put resource into that as a large organisation, but we expect to invest in that just like investing into machinery, because we think that will drive benefits in the future to understand what we're doing and what creates the best crop, what creates the best timing, the best quality, etc. over time.
It can be incredibly difficult when you're getting all this data from so many sources, but actually trying to use it to make real educated decisions can be quite difficult when you're having to flap from one platform to another to then go to a different piece of software to find out any other kind of influences on.
But on the other side, without daunting anybody, just start recording any basic data. Just having yield by variety by crop, for whether it's an arable crop, cereal crop, and how that relates to things like fertiliser. There's actually quite a lot of unsophisticated data that is actually still very powerful when it's been organised. By being able to filter it, find similar fields, similar varieties, different performances.
So when you're looking at other technologies that you might be thinking about bringing into your business, what are the kind of factors that you might weigh in or consider when you're actually assessing different types of solutions?
I think, first is actually understand what the problem is that you're trying to solve. So there is one of my pet phrases, there are lots of solutions looking for problems. Okay, so start with the problem and make sure that you're addressing that problem rather than shoehorning a solution into your system, because I think there are lots of solutions being offered from folks that don't necessarily understand what it's like at the coalface. With our modelling work, our problem was, how do I have more crop available at the right time? That was the key problem. And then you look at, what are the barriers to that and try and fill those gaps in. That's the approach. That would be definitely the first thing. I think the next thing would be, if it does offer part or all of the solution to that problem, simplicity, robustness, you mentioned earlier about having the visibility of the data, getting access to the data in a form that, effectively data needs to be knowledge. It's not just, data's just, a bit of a commodity, but actually you've got to convert it into something you can use and insights and what am I going to do differently because I've got this data, to put it simply, what's the action I can take because I've got some straightforward data. So if I can't get an actionable difference from the technology, why use it in a sort of a data perspective?
That makes a lot of sense, because you're absolutely right. And starting with the problem first and foremost as your primary considering factor is essential, really. Would you be able to give us an insight into any of the sort of technologies that G's Fresh may have brought in most recent?
Probably one of our, in terms of sort of tech and data, one of our recent additions is a carbon robotics laser weeder.
Wow.
An extremely expensive piece of equipment. And we've been wrestling with sort of weed control, weed pressure. There are less active substances available. We know herbicides are sort of, let's say in general, pesticides under challenge. It's more difficult, and we would like to use less of them anyway because they check the crop and all those sorts of food safety aspects, of course, as well. So we've been looking at various solutions, and in the end we plumped for this using maths that said, what is ultimately the return on investment. So that was the problem was we've got to kill weeds, particularly in organics. So it's not just in conventional replacing herbicides, but actually in organics we don't have any herbicides. So the first point of use is in our organic crop, where it's either cultural methods such as stale seed beds, potentially using plastic mulch to keep the weeds down, and otherwise it's hand weeding, which is becoming expensive, more difficult to get people. You don't necessarily always need 100 people every day, but you need them some days. It's just very challenging to sort of organise that. So it is simply a return on investment against sort of, I suppose, manpower availability and potentially looking for yield increases. So there's two aspects: replacing hand labour and the damage that hand labour causes to the yield of the crop. So you've got sort of two paybacks: saving labour as well as a yield benefit. And our view is that being able to use that machine pretty much 24/7, potentially 365 days between our UK and Spanish operations, you can get a good return on what appears to be an extremely expensive piece of kit, just using the maths of paybacks and the opportunity costs, etc. We took a long time over that decision. We were courted a long time. It's an extremely big number to invest in for one piece of equipment. Yeah. We're used to, we spend a lot of money on capex on a very big business, but that was just mentally a very big decision, and I can imagine that's a very big decision for many growers, farmers to adopt something that may be uncertain. Yeah, because there's lots of promises and jam tomorrow, and so obviously we went to see demos, we went to see practitioners that had these machines elsewhere in Europe that were using them in similar circumstances, similar soil types. We were meeting people that are actually buying a second one.
Right.
So that's quite a good vote of confidence. Yeah. So doing your homework, and seeing it in operation and understanding the data.
I ask a little bit about how you might measure the success of that investment.
Well, I think it will be tracking the measures we use to make the decision. So it will be changes in yield, are relatively concrete, because we'll know what the yield has been for the last 2 or 3 years,
right?
And therefore that should be relatively straightforward to monitor. And obviously the absence or using less manual labour. Yeah. They're actually in that way quite black and white, rather than it being a bit intangible.
Absolutely. Just one last question. How would you imagine that farming grown might change in the next 5 or 10 or even 20 years? Have you already got thoughts on what technologies are coming down the line that you're interested in, or have you got thoughts about how your business or the industry as a whole might be already progressing?
I certainly think data, and I know that's a sort of buzz phrase, and but ultimately converting data and understanding at a granular level what's happening in the crops that we grow and indeed in the sort of factory operations at a granular level just leads to continuous improvement. You know, online businesses are collating data, you know, fantastically quickly and fast every day with very definitive things. We're dealing with biology, and we need to understand how whatever the inputs are affect the outcome of that biology, and collecting the outcome, i.e. the yield, the size, the weight, the timing, is quite complicated, actually. Yeah, to link it back to all the parameters that created that outcome. So people think, well, I'm just going to suddenly do X, Y, and Z. Well, if you don't collect sort of yield data and quality data and those sorts of things, you won't have anything to model, because you haven't got an output. You've got lots of inputs, because they can be recorded quite easily once you've got the silos together, but actually they've all got to be linked to the outcome data to be able to work out what was good and what was bad.
Yeah, it's using, like you say, the data to give you real insights into exactly what's, like you say, your ins, your outs, how efficient the elements are going to be for your business. So yeah, thank you so much for your time, James. Really interesting to speak to you. Really appreciate you taking the time to answer those questions about technology at G's Fresh.
No, brilliant. Thanks very much.